Well, welcome back to chapter 51. This is part one of a two-part series on terrorism responses. This is one of those subjects that's always kind of tucked away at the end of the program, but it is something that is extremely important to be aware of and be prepared for, because essentially it's not if, it's a matter of when you're going to you're going to experience something along the lines of terrorism. Many of us living in Oklahoma throughout our career have had a couple of instances that we've had to deal with terrorism, over the years. So, and things have not gotten better; they've actually gotten a little worse, or at least the dangers have gotten a little worse. Over the last decade, the threat posed by political extremists, for instance, has sharply increased in the West, and that includes North America, Europe, and Australia. So as a paramedic, you should be mentally and physically prepared to respond to a terrorist event. Of course, terrorism threatens the health and safety of all responders, especially paramedic responders. For instance, during the sarin attacks in Tokyo in 1996, which wasn't all that long ago, there were approximately 100 emergency care responders that were sickened due to the lack of proper personal protective equipment. And then on September 11th, 2001, that brought health and safety risks for first responders to the forefront. There were more than 400 emergency responders killed that day. Many paramedics and EMTs have developed chronic disorders or experienced depression and psychological problems since then. So we lost 400 that day. We've lost hundreds more since then. EMS providers are encouraged to seek additional training and participate in drills to develop the skills needed to respond to these terrorist events. Of course, terrorism by definition is a violent and unlawful act that is dangerous to human life, and it's intended to intimidate or coerce government, the civilian population, or any segment between the two in the furtherance of some political or social objective. Terrorism can strike anywhere around the world. We used to think that here in the United States, that if you didn't live in a large, densely populated area that always seemed to kind of be the prime targets for terrorists, that you were going to be okay. Well, the Murrah bombing in Oklahoma City proved that theory wrong. They specifically chose a smaller populated state with the intention of believing that the response would be lessened and the likelihood of further damage and bigger loss of life would be extended, because it was in a more rural setting, even though Oklahoma City is technically considered more urban, but the state itself is much more rural in nature. So terrorists tend not to discriminate when they're selecting their targets, and have intentionally attacked children. For instance, in 2004, 30 heavily armed terrorists and suicide bombers took over a school in Russia, holding children hostage for over 3 days, and this resulted in over 334 hostages killed. Many of them were children because it was a school. In 2011, a lone terrorist exploded a car bomb and then opened fire at a summer camp, killing 69 people. So they don't discriminate, and they'll go after those softer targets, or those targets that they feel like are easy for them to get the most bang for their buck, if you'll pardon the term. International terrorism refers to acts of terror committed by foreign agents. It most often occurs in densely populated areas or mass gatherings, but sometimes, as I've mentioned before, can include suburban and even quiet rural areas. The goal while the goal is to inflict as much harm as possible, the bigger goal is to inflict terror, to make people afraid, to have them fearful of their daily lives, in an attempt to try to get them to change a particular behavior, or their government to change a particular behavior. Domestic terrorism, and of course we're probably all pretty familiar with the picture on your screen, refers to a terrorist plot or operation originating within the borders of the target country. Examples are going to include the 1984 salmonella poisonings that targeted government officials and the general population in Daly's, Oregon. And then, of course, the 95 explosion of the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City that killed 168 people. Then we even had letters that contained anthrax spores sent to New York, Washington, D.C., Palm Beach, Florida, and these ended up killing 5 and infecting more than 17 people. It made people fearful of opening their mail, and it caused the U.S. Postal Service to install machines that could specifically detect foreign substances like anthrax in mail. In 2013, multiple bombs at the Boston Marathon finish line exploded, killing 3 and injuring over 250 people. In 2016, a gunman claiming terrorist allegiance opened fire in the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, killing 49 people. So they intentionally pick these targets, and their goal is to spread fear. Terrorist organizations can be defined as one or more types. State terrorists engage in the systemic use of terror by an established government to control all or part of its populace. Religious extremists often seek apocalyptic violence or mass murder. They believe in eradicating or cleansing a religion of people who do not practice their same faith. Right-wing extremists aim to limit government pressure, preserve traditional social orders, and combat left-wing groups. They may be formed as militias or gangs, or often motivated by conspiracy theories to suppress other racial or cultural groups, such as through racial supremacy. Left-wing extremists, on the other hand, aim to limit corporations and businesses, overturn traditional establishments, and combat right-wing groups. They may be formed as loose groups or cells and are often motivated to eliminate class and culture divides. Issue-oriented groups include the anti-abortion groups and eco-terrorists. They threaten or use violence as a way to advance their views or goals. These groups usually represent a violent side of what's typically a non-violent group that seeks to effect change through legal and socially acceptable means. But you get some of them that are kind of on the fringes that go a little more extreme. Separatists seek political, economic, and social freedom. They may seek to kill or evict foreigners, migrants, or other people with different ethnic, racial, sociologic, or other cultural backgrounds. Separatists use terror to influence economic and immigration policies and the drawing and redrawing of geopolitical borders. Narco-terrorists use terror to take control of a region, its politics, or government with the goal of manufacturing, distributing, and selling drugs. They often target military, police, anti-drug politicians, government officials, and innocent civilians to gain control from local authorities. The revenue from drugs makes these groups more heavily armed, organized, and funded than local authorities. Pathologic terrorists have no motivation beyond their own desire to control and terrorize others. They do not often conspire with more than 2 or 3 other people regarding their terroristic operations. Terrorist groups thrive in regions with little government organization. Many groups establish training camps and operation bases in remote, austere locations. Most attacks require multiple terrorists or actors that work together. These individuals are recruited, trained, financed, and provided with equipment and intelligence. In cases with only a few terrorists or a single terrorist, attacks can be extremely difficult to predict. Paramedics should be familiar with the key initial actions to manage hazardous scenes, including getting hazmat on the way, looking for terrorist incidents and scenes of mass violence. Acts of terror are not usually covert, and the public safety community typically has no prior knowledge of when, where, or the nature of the attack. It is important that you can recognize risks and high-value targets. High-value targets for terrorists include things like major athletic events, concerts, ceremonies, and parades where large crowds gather. So, as I mentioned, they get a little more bang for their buck out of those. They also include locations where damage or destruction could provoke extreme fear, such as nuclear power plants and research facilities, chemical factories, biologic laboratories, and petroleum distillation and storage facilities. Targets also include locations where attacks could provoke extreme emotional reactions, such as daycare centers, schools, healthcare facilities, abortion clinics, and even churches. High-value targets, of course, are among the greatest concerns, and these locations are going to be things like, those crucial infrastructure type or transportation locations, such as airports, subways, tunnels, and bridges, and then some of those industry and infrastructure things like power plants, water treatment plants, manufacturing, dams, reservoirs, power lines, natural gas lines. And then they'll move on to potentially those things of symbolic significance like government buildings, corporate headquarters, military installations, monuments, and even national parks. All, as well as the emergency response, those things that are vital to an emergency response like police stations, fire stations, EMS facilities, hospitals, and dispatch centers. Any one of these are considered high-value targets for terrorists because of the impact that they'll have. Many of these are going to have some pretty big ripple effects if they're impacted, because they may not be functioning for a number of days, months, or years. The National Terrorism Advisory System issues alerts in response to threats within the United States and their territories. These alerts will inform responders about the potential for attack and specifics about the threat, including who will be potentially affected, the geographic area, transportation concerns, and the nature of the threat. The National Terrorism Advisory System also includes steps to take for protection. The system specifies if the threat is elevated, meaning there is no specific information about timing or location, or if it's imminent, meaning that the threat is believed to be impending or expected soon. Alerts are posted to the dhs.gov website, dhs.gov/alerts website, and distributed through social media. The DHS has not issued specific recommendations for EMS personnel to follow in response to the alert system, so you're probably not going to see something that's very EMS specific. It's going to be kind of more general, and typically these alerts go out so that more people are paying attention to, kind of the whole see something, say something thinking. That way, perhaps something can be prevented or, lessened if it does happen. So while on duty, you should observe pre-incident indicators such as those threat warnings, increased violent political activism, and any credible threats made against the location, gathering, or an occasion that may be coming up. Pay attention to the type of location, including monuments, infrastructures, government buildings, specific locations like temples, large gatherings such as parades or political demonstrations, or special events like college football games, or even high school football games. Note the type of call, where it's whether it's a report of an explosion or suspicious device, unexplained coughing and difficulty breathing, or reports of people fleeing the scene. Consider the number of patients, as the most important clue is multiple patients with similar signs and symptoms. That's really going to start to clue you in that something is going on, and it may be tied to a terrorist event. Listen to victim statements, with the second best indication of being people fleeing the scene giving statements like, everyone is passing out, there was a loud explosion, there are a lot of people laying on the ground. Those kinds of things are going to give you indications of what everybody's running from and what you're going to be moving towards. So you should suspect an attack and ensure that the scene is safe, and make sure yours and your partner's safety is taken care of. Let dispatch and supervisors know of what you believe is going on. Request those additional and specialized resources. Establish or coordinate with command, so that command structure is going to start to fall into place, and then begin to initiate that mass casualty incident procedure, to where that you're beginning to gather the resources that you think you're going to need based on what size of an event that you believe that you're dealing with. Don't enter if there's any doubts about safety or if there's any issues related to safety. The best location for staging is, of course, upwind and uphill from the incident, because many of these terroristic incidents are hazardous. And then, of course, wait for the assistance of trained personnel to get there before you start to try to take care of patients. Now, the walking wounded that can come up to you, so long as they're not contaminated, can be treated. But if there's risk of contamination, you need to make sure that those are decontaminated before you begin treating them. So that way you're not contaminating yourselves, your equipment, your truck, and everything else. Remember that failure to park your vehicle at a safe location can place you and your partner in danger, and it could actually take your vehicle out of service. Your vehicle could get exposed or contaminated with something as such, and everybody has to retreat from that area, that your vehicle just gets left there. So you want to keep that in mind, as not winding up putting your vehicle in a position to where that it cannot be used anymore. If your vehicle winds up being blocked in by other emergency vehicles, or damaged by a secondary device, or if it gets trapped in because it gets locked into the hot zone because you drove into it unwittingly, is typically how that happens, but your truck may be stuck there. It may not be able to leave that zone because it becomes contaminated. Now we're not able to utilize it for transporting patients. And typically in these things, we need as many transport units as we can come up with. Responder health and safety, of course, can suffer more than usual during weapons of mass destruction incidents. These incidents oftentimes begin to cloud decision making, and paramedics may begin to develop some tunnel vision with these as well. So they start focusing on the one patient. They're going to put all these efforts and time into this one patient when it's really need to be focusing on the big picture of the most patients. So you have to kind of guard yourself against that, and listen when somebody's telling you, hey, there's more than this one, don't focus in, don't get tunnel vision. That way we can utilize those resources, and the resource being you as a paramedic, as best as we can. Key resources in a potentially hazardous scene include awareness of self-preservation measures and a culture of safety within your organization. So this should be key. It should be kind of ingrained and inbuilt, is that culture of safety within your organization is essential, because having that culture of safety and this being kind of second nature to everybody in your organization makes the likelihood or the possibility of somebody getting into a hazardous situation much less, because of that culture of safety. It's just the way that you live. It's the way that you do things. It's not something that you have to go, okay, we have this particular incident and I need to think about these safety things. If you live it every day, you don't have to think about it in the moment. Other important resources are having previous knowledge, doing that fit testing stuff, having experience, and a good comfort level using multiple types and brands of personal protective equipment. Just being familiar with that stuff, knowing how that stuff works, and being able to utilize it. Using the proper PPE and self-enforcement of all protective measures are crucial. They're crucial resources as much as any other resource is. So that is really, really helpful, is being familiar with and knowing how to use the PPE when you're in these incidents. The best form of protection is preventing contact with any kind of an agent. The greatest threat is contamination and cross-contamination. As I mentioned a little bit ago, making sure that we're not contaminating and then contaminating our equipment that contaminates us and then contaminates future patients that we're picking up. So that's a big deal. So decontamination is really, really important for patients exposed or contaminated with chemical, biologic, radiologic, or nuclear, or whatever, even explosive agents. That way we don't worry about contaminating and cross-contaminating and do all those kinds of things that can be problematic on down the road, days or even weeks later. As soon as you suspect a terrorist or weapon of mass destruction event, notify the dispatcher and incident commander or both, or just basically notify everybody. Vital information that's going to be really helpful that you can relay is going to be things like the nature of the event, if you know of any specific additional resources that are going to be needed, number of patients, where if you know where upwind and downwind is, so that you can help determine an optimal routes in and out of the area. And of course, those all of these things need to be communicated effectively so that everyone responding understands. Then you want to make sure that you establish a safe staging area, taking into consideration access and exit routes, as well as which way the prevailing winds are blowing and that kind of stuff, because those are things you need to keep into consideration. And of course, hazmat teams should be requested as soon as possible, because depending on where you're at, they may not be close by or local. They may have to come from a larger city or neighboring cities, or perhaps the hazmat team that would normally respond to that is actually part of the incident. So we've got to call for, from things from neighboring areas. The command structure, if the incident command system is already in place, find the medical staging supervisor to get your assignment. Paramedics who arrive on the scene first may need to establish incident command until additional personnel arrive. Depending on the circumstance, you and other paramedics may act as the medical branch supervisors, doing triage supervision, treatment supervision, and dealing with transport or logistics, as well as other staffing needs until others arrive, and then your role may change. It may or may not change. You may wind up staying in the role that you're in until you're relieved at the end of your shift as well. Tasks of the first arriving paramedics are going to include reporting the incident to the command post when you have a unified command system, establish a medical branch under the operations section, determine the scope and scale of the incident, including the type of the incident, hazards to responders and victims, the number of patients, and the number of deceased, and the safe access and egress, as well as staging locations for the area. Gather information on the decontamination area or areas, and then as well as the hot, warm, and cold zones, so you know where the perimeters are of the entire incident. Regularly gather and disseminate information to dispatch as you're working your way through the scene. Establish and assign a supervisor for decontamination, triage, treatment, transport, staging, and rehabilitation areas. Report all EMS activities to the operations section chief. That way they're well informed of what is going on. Expect a heavy police presence at each EMS sector. Police will provide site security, monitor all victims for potential accomplices among the injured, and canvass witnesses. Paramedics should fully comply with all law enforcement requests. Remember, we got to work as a team. Secondary device or event safety issues. Terrorists often plant additional explosives or secondary devices to explode after the initial bomb. So never become so involved in a task that you do not look around to reassess the safety of the scene. This is something that has become more and more common, where they create an event to bring everybody in, and then they use additional devices to harm the responders. that dramatically hampers the response to that particular event and causes a lot more collateral damage with a whole lot of rippling effects as well. Weapons of mass destruction, of course, are anything that is used as a weapon designed to bring about mass death, casualties, or a massive amount of damage to property and infrastructure. They're grouped into 5 major categories, and those are chemical, biologic, radiologic, nuclear, and explosive. With terrorist groups changing their motives and tactics towards widespread killing, weapons of mass destruction are highly desired by them. Weapons of mass destruction are relatively easy to obtain and or create, and are designed to kill a large number of people. Technical recipes for making nuclear, biologic, chemical weapons, and explosive devices can be found readily on the internet. Chemical agents are human-made substances that can have a devastating effect on living organisms. They are produced in multiple forms depending on the route of exposure and the dissemination technique that's going to be used, and these can include liquids, powders, or vapors. Chemical agents were first developed during World War I, and they were used to a great effect during World War I, so much so that many of them were banned through international agreements prior to World War II. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, recognizes chemical agents by how they work and the signs and symptoms that they produce. There's biotoxins such as ricin, blister agents like mustard gas, blood agents like carbon monoxide, caustic agents such as hydrofluoric acid and hydrogen chloride, choking and pulmonary agents, and ammonia is a big one among that. Incapacitating agents such as fentanyl or opioids. That should kind of ring true a little bit because of all the fentanyl overdoses that we've had here in the United States over the last few years. Long-lasting anticoagulants, poisonous metals such as arsenic and mercury, nerve agents, sarin makes that list as well. There's even Novichok is in there. Organic solvents such as benzene, riot control agents such as CS gases, toxic alcohols, vomiting agents, and those kinds of things are all commonly used or can be used in one way or another by terrorists, and they're all considered chemical agents. Chemical weapons have several classifications based on the properties or characteristics of the agent, such as if it's a liquid, solid, or a gas. Persistency and volatility describe how long the agent will stay on the surface. Persistent or non-volatile agents can remain for longer than 24 hours, while non-persistent or volatile agents evaporate fast in optimal temperatures. Highly persistent agents can remain in the environment for weeks or months, whereas highly volatile agents will evaporate within minutes to seconds. So it all just depends on how that agent is supplied and what its volatility is. Blister agents, also known as vesicants, the primary route of exposure is on the skin. If left on the skin or clothing for long enough, vesicants will produce vapors that enter the respiratory tract. They cause burn-like blisters that form on the skin and in the respiratory tract. These agents consist of sulfur mustard, and other agents that are very similar to that. They cause the most damage to moist areas of the body, such as the armpits, groin, and the respiratory tract. Signs of exposure on the skin is going to include skin irritation, burning, and reddening. Immediate intense pain is a sign, especially with some of these agents. Other signs are the formation of large blisters and gray discoloration of the skin, which is a sign of permanent damage seen with a few of the agents as well. The eyes may become swollen and closed or irritated, potentially leading to permanent eye injury, including blindness. Signs of inhalation vapors include hoarseness and stridor, severe cough, hemoptysis, and severe shortness of breath. There are really no antidotes for sulfur mustard or phosgene gases related to blister agents. There are some antidotes for some of the others, but these antidotes are not typically carried by civilian EMS. So what we have to do is ensure that the patient has been thoroughly decontaminated before we start the ABCs. Usually we're going to decontaminate them with soap and copious amounts of water. A patient may require prompt airway support after decontamination, and we might want to initiate transport and gain IV access as soon as possible and get them on the road so we can get them to the hospital. Typically, burn centers are the best equipped to handle wounds and the infections that can result from the use of vesicant agents. Choking and pulmonary agents are toxic inhalation hazards. These are gases that cause immediate harm to those that are exposed. The primary route of exposure is through the respiratory tract, posing an inhalation or vapor hazard. They damage lung tissue, causing fluid to leak into the lungs and produce respiratory-related symptoms such as shortness of breath, tachypnea, and pulmonary edema. Chlorine is one of those such agents, and it was the first agent ever used in chemical warfare. It has the distinct odor of bleach, and when released as a gas, it creates a green haze. Chlorine initially produces upper airway irritation and the sensation of choking. Symptoms a patient may experience later on include shortness of breath, burning and tightness in the chest, hoarseness and stridor, gasping and coughing, and watery eyes and drooling. Serious exposure may cause pulmonary edema, complete airway constriction, and death. When household bleach is mixed with ammonia, it creates an acid gas with very similar effects to this chlorine gas. So when we're dealing with choking and pulmonary agents, we want to remove the patient from the contaminated atmosphere and decontaminate them immediately, and then aggressively manage the ABCs as the patient's activity worsens their condition much faster. There is no antidote to counteract pulmonary agents. Basically, to manage these agents, we're going to manage the ABCs, get an IV, and allow the patient to rest in a position of comfort with their head elevated, and then initiate rapid transport. Pharmacotherapy may include standard treatment for bronchospasms, pulmonary edema, maybe the use of corticosteroids, and even positive pressure ventilation with supplemental oxygen may be necessary as well. Blood agents, hydrogen cyanide and cyanogen chloride affect the body's ability to use oxygen. Cyanide is a colorless gas with an odor similar to almonds. Its effects begin at the cellular level and are quickly seen at the organ system level. Cyanide is commonly found in industrial settings and is produced in large quantities everywhere in the United States. So symptoms found in cyanide exposure and as well as cyanogen chloride exposure are very, very similar because they the results are basically the same, have very similar symptoms. Low dose symptoms can include dizziness, lightheaded, headache, vomiting. High dose symptoms are going to include shortness of breath, gasping respirations, tachycardia, flushed skin, altered mental status, seizures, coma, maybe even cardiac arrest. When inhaled, symptoms appear within several minutes, and death is likely unless the person is treated promptly. Several medications act as antidotes and many departments carry cyanide antidote kits. Trained personnel wearing proper personal protective equipment should remove the patient from the source of the exposure and remove all clothing to prevent off-gassing in the ambulance. Incapacitating agents are chemicals and drugs that produce a disabling condition, typically acting as a central nervous system depressant. They can include military-grade agents, and common opioids such as fentanyl and its derivatives. Fentanyl seems to be kind of the big one. Treatment is typically based on the presenting signs and symptoms. Antidotes are agent specific. Identified opioids may be reversed with Narcan, for instance, but other agents are going to require different antidotes. Long-acting blood thinners, these are poisons that specifically blocks the blood's ability to clot. And the good example of this is something called superwarfarin. So we're familiar with warfarin, but superwarfarin is the example that they're using. There's no treatment beyond managing presenting signs and symptoms, as there is no antidote or specific treatment for those particular things. Poisonous metals include inherently poisonous elements such as arsenic or mercury. There's no antidote or specific treatment beyond decontamination and management of signs and symptoms. And these are typically pretty unfortunate things that happen if they're able to even survive. It's going to be a long-term issue, a lifelong issue. So, all right, that's part one of terrorism response. And I'll be back at part two of chapter 51.